part, because
we do have a YouTube channel, so that's most likely where we will post it, and we'll let you all know. Next slide. I just wanted to start before we dive in with a land acknowledgement. So my place of residence is Olympia, Washington, and I reside on traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Nisqually, Coast Salish, Cowlitz, and Chehalis nations. And I just want to acknowledge the painful history and the genocide, right, and the forced removal from this territory, and pay our respect to the diverse Indigenous people that are still connected to this land. And just give thanks to all of the tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. And if you're interested, we make available this reference so you can actually find what tribes are in your place of residence. So as I said, so I am with the Population Health Innovation Lab, and for us, our nirvana really is about supporting success of health-focused multi-sector collaboratives and or accountable communities of health. And we do that through a variety of different ways. This is one of them, really bringing people together in learning. So we're excited. And I just want to acknowledge the fact that the work that you are all doing as change agents is hard. Like, it's very, very isolating. And it can be lonely at times. And so for us, you know, creating conditions where people can come together in learning is something that we, you know, are really, really excited to do on a regular basis. Next slide. So just before we dive in, we're just, you know, I'm welcoming you, and, you know, we're going to do a poll. So kind of giving a sense of a couple of things. Liz is going to be doing a Targeted Universalism 101. We're going to do some breakout groups, kind of reflecting on what we're hearing. Then we're going to hear back from Liz on some concrete examples, like what is this and how has she actually put it into play? And then dialogue about specific focus areas of your work, like where might you apply this and use this in closing. So today really is about providing an overview of what targeted universalism is, and to be able to share some concrete examples that have been in use, right, in North Sound Accountable Community of Health, clear on the north part of this state, of the beautiful state of Washington. And really you all to explore how you could use this, how could it be useful, right, in the focus of your work. And also just to provide an opportunity for you all as ACH leaders and or health focused multi-sector collaborative leads to be in dialogue and learning with each other. So next slide. I think actually now we're gonna stop sharing, and I'm gonna turn it over to Christina. We're gonna do a poll.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are at the moment. Thank you guys for joining us today. I'm Christina Olson, one of the program associates with the Population Health Innovation Lab. I'm going to help with some of the technical background. We've got our other teammate, Catherine Stewart here, who's running slides. But we wanted to start off with a little bit of intro for you guys. When you registered, we did ask people a couple questions just to kind of better understand the audience that was going to be engaging with us. Pretty much 50, 60, 70% of the people, somewhere between there, were aware of targeted universalism. So we have a good sense of people at least having heard about this before, have some sense of knowledge. If you are not one of those people, don't stress. We will be introducing a little bit more about what this framework is. We've got our fabulous speaker, Liz, who's going to be doing that for us. But we just kind of wanted to intro everybody to that. And we actually want to start you off with a bit of a poll to find out a little bit more about you. This poll is going to serve for us to kind of get a general sense of the audience, but also we're going to use the results of this for a future breakout room for you guys to be able to kind of connect with colleagues that are working in similar areas. So I am going to launch a poll real quick. That should be coming up on your side of the screen. And we'd like you to answer, what is the focus of your work? Feel free to select all that apply. And if you are someone who has an other focus to your work, feel free to add that into the chat, in addition to putting other there, because I'm guessing there will be many others. We'll just leave this open for another few seconds. We've got some good participation rate right now. And thank you for those who are adding in the chat, what your other focus areas are. I see assessment and planning, adolescent health, chronic disease prevention management, population focused health, well-being, equity. All right, I am going to end this poll so we can all see the results here. So it looks like we have a fair number of people working in behavioral health as well as COVID response, kind of a high number, about half of the people working in some of those areas. Also quite a few working in homelessness, as well as those other areas which we see there in the chat. Thank you guys for adding that information. And then a smaller number of people working around domestic violence, early childhood, some around food security or aging. Thank you guys so much. This is just helpful context for all of us to get to know one of another. We in our events like to promote not just connecting via a screen and web discussion, but also with your colleagues, kind of a networking type of thing. So as I mentioned, we will be using these as breakout rooms in the future. But we have one more poll that we'd like to launch for you guys. And this one is really just for fun. So let me launch that real quick. And this is a true question here that we want you to answer. Hand on heart here. Are you wearing pajamas right now? We are very serious here about this question. So feel free to answer whatever is the correct information for you at the moment. This is the question people have been wanting to ask, but maybe have not asked for the last almost year and a half or so during COVID times for many. We'll give you just another 10 seconds on this one. All right, and I'm going to share those results. Dun-dun-dun. So most people are saying, no, of course not. You are not wearing pajamas right now. We do have a couple honest people, business on top, pajamas on the bottom, totally fine. We welcome you in whatever state you are today to our web discussion. We're very excited to have you. Hopefully this brought a little bit of a smile to your face as you start our web discussion with us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sue to introduce our fabulous speaker for today. Thank you all so much for your participation.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm excited to introduce to you Liz Baxter, and she is the CEO and she reports to the North Sound Accountable Community of Health Board of Directors. And she is responsible for assuring that the organization has sound strategies in place to achieve the goals and the strategic directions set by the board. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liz.
Thank you so much, Sue. And I don't know if it counts as pajamas if I tell you that I can fall asleep in any clothing. So, I don't know what the significance is of the pajamas piece, even though I said no. Just appreciate being on the call with you all, and would like to just start with introducing you. I see a lot of familiar faces on the call that are up here in this part of the state. But the state of Washington is divided into 9 ACH regions. So this notion of accountable communities of health is something that the Washington Healthcare Authority has adopted, and they put this map together back in probably 2013, 2014. And it mostly aligns with other maps. So if you were looking at how the Department of Health divides the state into regions, you know, kind of like a county or two might be in different regions, but it mostly aligns. And so most state agencies have divided the state of Washington into, you know, somewhere 8 or 9 regions. For anybody who doesn't know Washington, who might be on the call, north of us is Canada. So, you know, our office is based in Bellingham, Washington. We're about 35 miles from the Canadian border. And as you can see, the geography really matters. And that matters whether you're in California, Ohio, wherever you are. You know, you can have single counties that are large in population, large in number of providers, and probably larger organizations. You can be a really broad geographic region, but a smaller population and really differently sized provider networks. As Sue introduced, Washington has 29 federally recognized tribes. In the North Sound region, we have 8 of those tribes whose traditional homelands are here. Our office is on the traditional homelands of the Lummi and Nooksack people, and how it is that we partner with tribes, tribal organizations, tribal providers is also just a really significant part of the work that the ACH does. But there's one other thing that I do want to mention. And so if you look at the North Sound ACH up there in that, you know, pretty kind of greenish color, we also have geography that sometimes is a mountain range that runs down the middle of your state. For us, we also have just the beautiful Puget Sound, the Salish Sea. So we have got a couple of counties where bodies of water are also a barrier, and sometimes barrier to access and emergency resources that we have to navigate. So we have in the North Sound region one county that is fully separated from the mainland, and a second county that is connected to the mainland only by a very, very high and narrow bridge over Deception Pass. And otherwise, we really have 2 significant parts of counties that are dependent on a ferry system, an emergency air transport system, and that factors in to how we've actually incorporated targeted universalism on a number of things. And then for North Sound, just as a little tiny bit of history, we became the North Sound ACH back in 2014, and in 2017 became part of this federal waiver that the state of Washington took on, which is known here in Washington as the Medicaid Transformation Project. And so across the state, just a real variety of how different regions have taken on this work. So we'll go to the next slide. Last December, though, was the culmination of, I'm going to say, perhaps about 18 months of work that was looking at how do we shift from a focus that is really inside of framing around healthcare. How do we move from being focused on health improvement, improving healthcare outcomes, that if we really were going to incorporate this notion of advancing equity, addressing racism, looking at how it is that we become a factor in that across our region and across our state, that we needed to think differently about our reason for existence. And so I'm sure that all of you have been part of conversations that are, how do you devise your mission or your vision, and what's the difference between a mission and a vision? And so our board was actually having a conversation about when this Medicaid waiver ends, which for us is December 31st of 2021, what is our reason to continue? Should we close our doors? Like, what is it that would be our purpose? And they came up with this statement, which the board voted on in December of 2020, that we exist to create a just and inclusive culture and the necessary conditions for all community members to thrive. And that was, for those who have gone through processes, it was really an amazing process to watch the board say, we actually aren't concerned with the mission or vision. We wanted to know, why do we exist? And so this was the statement that they approved, and it actually helped us to align our work with the Medicaid waiver or whatever might come next, that we would take part in those things if it was helping us to actually move forward with this type of alignment with our purpose for being. So we'll go to the next slide. And I would typically do these in the inverse order, but I just, since we're going to get to targeted universalism, I'm going to do them in this order. We were heavily influenced by the work that happened both with the 100 Million Healthier Lives campaign run out of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement and kind of its next iteration. I don't know if they would appreciate me saying it in that way, but Shoma Saha, who led the 100 Million Healthier Lives campaign, is now leading an effort called Wellbeing in the World, or We in the World. And they introduced us about 2 years ago to this notion of the vital conditions for well-being. And again, it allowed us to step outside of the health and healthcare space and try and envision, how do we actually move to those upstream social determinants of health areas that are what impacts our ability to get to being in a space where we feel like I can actually optimize my own well-being. And so this gave us a framework to say, when we think about our future state, what are those areas where we feel like we want to have some leverage? And I think for your first poll set of questions, a couple of you were in those spaces that aren't necessarily in healthcare, but you're looking at housing, you're looking at poverty, you're looking at other things that have a significant impact. We'll go to the next slide. And so in 2017, our team was introduced to Targeted Universalism. We were in the middle of having to write, it felt like books, for becoming part of the Medicaid waiver in Washington. And we did one of our very first training sessions with clinical partners and community-based organizations, was a training session on the intersection of race and health equity. And part of that is because Washington's waiver actually had 5 objectives.
You were leaning against the door.
Oh, I thought that was me. And
No,
so,
I don't. No, I don't.
oh, Starlene, you may need to mute. Thank you. And so in 2017, we were looking at 5 objectives, and those objectives were things like, behavioral health integration with primary care. How do we get, providers to enter into value-based contracts? But the 5th objective was to advance equity and reduce disparities. And so as we were looking at that language, what we realized is that we had a lot of expectations and metrics related to hemoglobin A1Cs and kids getting to the dentist and who's getting to primary care. And we actually had 0 accountabilities around the 5th objective of advancing equity and reducing disparities. So we were really excited at this notion that targeted universalism might be a way for us to make a difference in our region. And so John Powell leads the Othering and Belonging Institute, which is based at Berkeley. And what he had stated was that he was beginning to see this kind of progression. He had started in the world of equality back in the 60s and 70s. He watched that evolve into a discussion around equity. He moved this to targeted universalism, and you'll see in a couple of slides that he's now talking about othering and belonging. How that this is really the problem that we have here in the 21st century, is how it is that we look at those who are around us and how we can navigate some of that space. So if we go to the next slide, please. And so John would describe that othering is really just a way for us to marginalize a group of people, and that it's some basis around some group status, and that we do that in lots of different ways. We might marginalize young kids. They don't understand, the circumstances well enough to be able to actually have, a voice in an issue. We might marginalize women versus men. We might marginalize people where English is, not their first language, different than those where English is really easy for them to navigate. And it's not about individual identities. It's really about how do we give some power and limit power among others. And so part of what I'm hoping that you might do, during the session is to think about different decisions that come into play where we are thinking about how we can actually separate people into different groups, as opposed to what targeted universalism is going to do, is it's going to say, actually, you can come up with a universal goal and try to figure out unique strategies for everyone to reach that goal. So if we go to the next slide. But the other thing that, we just are really prone to do is we think that the opposite of othering is to treat everyone the same. So it probably takes some of you back to thinking about discussions where you're trying to distinguish between what's the difference between equity and equality. And that we're not trying to have everyone be the same. We are trying to figure out a way that everyone can feel that they have a sense that they belong in this whole that we're creating. And that would be whole with a W, not whole with an H, because I don't want to have people falling into holes either. So we'll go to the next slide. So one of the examples that John Powell would use is, to think about inviting people to a party. And so, he's from academia, and, there are probably a lot of parties that, are at the dean's house or the chair's house or any of those things. And that there are those people who are left out. They're excluded because they're not part of the hierarchy within academia. And then you might have folks who say, well, let's have a diverse group at the party. And so there might be some people who get invited to the party. It looks like they're a part of the party, but they got invited. They might be sitting in, the back. They're in different chairs than those who are at the inner circle. They weren't a part of deciding what's the agenda, how are we going to pull this party together. They're certainly not in charge of the food or the drink or anything like that, but they are there. And so that kind of gets you to a level of diversity, but not necessarily inclusion. And what John would describe as belonging is really a process of co-creation. So how do we get to a point where if people belong, they actually get to decide, well, should we have that party here or should we have that party at, Swinomish? They've got a great site. We would actually be in place with our tribal partners. How do we think about location? What's the food that's going to occur? What's the music that's going to happen? Who's in charge? Who's the MC? Who's going to actually welcome us to this space? And so belonging actually takes all of the structures and turns them to the people who are part of that event or that project or that initiative actually being in power and having the ability to influence and make decisions about all of the elements that would be in play. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is a image that I'm sure you have all seen. I think it probably began circulating somewhere in the 1990s, and it was how folks distinguish between equality and equity. That somehow equality was this equal distribution of resources. It didn't matter who you were, you would get the same across those resources. But then in equity, you take the resources and you actually distribute them differently. And that somehow, though, it also includes the notion that there are limited resources, there are only 3 boxes for us to distribute, and that somehow the goal in this image is that everyone gets to see over the fence in order to watch this game. And it doesn't allow for, well, I wonder if there are actually some other boxes that are sitting off to the side. I wonder if the folks who are outside the fence would actually like to be inside the fence. Would they like to be in one of those stadium seats? Might they like to be on a team? Might they like to want to own one of these teams? And instead, all we did was to create a space where even in this image, there are 3 brown people who are now standing behind a fence watching something that they were not allowed to actually come inside and take part in. So if you go to the next slide. And so another organization kind of inverted that slide. So if you were inside and you were watching from the inside to outside, you might look at that equity piece And you might either say, wow, look at those folks who are standing on the outside of the fence. They are equitably able to see over the side of the fence. So the resources must be fine. They've all gotten to the same level of access. But if you look behind the fence, what you also might see is that the circumstances around each of those individuals are different. And this is where you can put in different access to transportation, different access to education, different access potentially to a paying, living wage job. That we have to be able to look behind some of this data and understand what the individual circumstances are for everyone and each of the populations that we're focused on. So we'll go to the next slide, because this is the slide that came to us back in September of 2017 that made our team say, this is what we have been looking for. And so what targeted universalism is kind of the counterpoint to. The image on the left is how we traditionally look at implementing strategies. So we take a single strategy, whether it's evidence-based, it's something that's trending, it's something that's really popular and got momentum behind it, and we say we're going to implement strategy ABC in our community. It's going to help with kids learning to read. It's going to help with kids, graduating from high school. It's going to help with something because it's really popular and it has shown success in San Antonio. It's shown success in Los Angeles. So we implement it and we're really excited that we have this great strategy. Even if we might accept it will not work for everyone. We accept the fact that we might not get to 100%. But if we can get our graduation rates from 67% to 82%, that is an incredible success marker. And we don't always go back and say, I wonder if we did that 82% at the expense of a subpopulation that actually went from 64% to 62%. As long as that overall number got better, we consider that a success. So that's been our traditional way of approaching strategies. We pick the strategy, acknowledging it might not work for everyone. So targeted universalism says, instead of focusing on the strategy, why don't you focus on actually deciding what's your universal goal? So if my universal goal, if I go back to any of those others, is 100% of the kids in high school are going to be able to graduate from high school. Now the onus is on me to figure out, what do I know about the kids in my high school? What are the things that are getting in the way for them? How do I create strategies so that every child can graduate from high school? That's my universal goal. And what a, kid who lives in an affluent neighborhood, who has access to great resources, who has been reading since kindergarten, who has the ability to go to college and is prepared for that, I have strategies for them. I want to support them to be able to graduate from high school. But I'm also looking for strategies for kids where English isn't spoken at home.
Nah, that was me.
Where there are kids who don't have a library card, who don't have transportation, who don't live in a neighborhood where they can actually access the same types of resources. I'm going to have strategies for them as well. And so the strategy is different. The goal is the same. And the goal is really to make sure no one gets left out when I'm trying to reach this goal. So we'll go to the next slide. And so if you were to go to the Othering and Belonging Institute, there's an amazing primer on targeted universalism that lays out the process that you could go through. But these are the kind of the high level steps that you would put in place. You're going to be trying to articulate what that goal is. But in order to do that, you have to understand the population that you're working with. You need to know not only what do they have in common, but what are the differences among your population. What is it going to take for them to get to that universal goal? You look at data, and so I am both I think a kind of a visionary, but I'm also a data geek. So it's like I want to know my data. I want to know about the geography. I want to know about any trends or patterns in data. If we don't have data, I'm going to try and find data that can help us understand that. And that includes learning from community, because a lot of the time there isn't necessarily great data. And so I have to go to community and learn from them and figure out what their assets are. And then I'm going to try to implement targeted strategies that look at every subset of the population to try and help them get to that universal goal. And you'll probably hear me say this a lot. The process is so that nobody is left out. How you do this is just really critical. And, we had this session just this morning with our team where one of our team members shared like a great analogy that I probably had never heard before. And he said it would be like having an emergency department where, regardless of what your condition was when you entered the emergency department, they decided that everyone would get the same strategy, and it would be ibuprofen. So it wouldn't matter if you came in with a broken leg, if you came in with heart disease, if you came in because you were bleeding. If we wanted to treat everybody the same, we would just have something that says, that's really great. I hope you take these 2 ibuprofen and let us know if that doesn't work. Obviously, we would never do that. We have pieces of our system where we're really good at trying to figure out what's the strategy that each person needs. We're just not as good at it when we're talking about population-based strategies. So we'll go to the next slide. And so one of the pieces when you're looking at data is really to figure out who's actually contributed to the data. Whose stories are you hearing? Who's left out? Who do I need to take that extra step? And I need to go to them and find out whether I have an incomplete story or I don't have any knowledge at all about what their situation is. And how do we, as policymakers and decision makers, get to a point where we're expanding our circles enough to include everyone so that when we're talking about those specific targeted strategies, they are based on knowledge and reality of what our different subcommunities need to have in place. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to give just 3 really short examples. These are not policy work examples, but probably some that you have experienced. So back in the day when we used to be in real rooms together, I imagine that you've all been in a room where there's AV set up and a microphone, and someone goes up to the microphone and says, I think my voice is loud enough. I don't think I need to use the microphone. Can you all hear me okay? And they put the microphone down. And you will have the people who are close at hand to that person will say, oh, yeah, we can hear you. Without recognizing it might be one or it might be some people in the room that once that person put the microphone down will not be able to hear. It might be a hearing impairment. It might be that it's bad acoustics in a room. And that we don't recognize by not using a tool that would actually ensure that everyone had the ability to hear what was going on in the room. By putting it down, we have actually advantaged some and disadvantaged others in a room. And it's pretty rare to have somebody raise their hand and say, yeah, well, I can't hear you. Because then you're asking people to self-identify, kind of name themselves as not being in the same space as the universal group. And that's tough. When that does happen, it's great, but it's not very common. So the second example, kind of just shifting across the slide, imagine, 14 months ago, the message to us, wear a mask, wear a mask, wear a mask. I don't know how many of you have lost all your brain cells since 14 months ago, but 14 months ago, you could have had $1,500 and you couldn't find a box of masks. The supply chain was absolutely decimated. And so we could tell people you need to wear a mask, but there were some people who could not find a mask and still needed to get to work, go to our grocery store, do the things that would allow them and their families to actually survive the beginning of last summer. we started, and it's just amazing how this has flipped on its ear. So we started shaming people who didn't wear a mask. And without absolutely at all trying to understand, we did not have a supply available so that everyone, regardless of income, could have a mask. So we needed to do things to alter that strategy and did a number of things along the way. And then the last one, which is perhaps more for humor, but for those of us like me who wear glasses most of the time during the day, if you can envision walking into a room and you just have to like put your glasses like in a basket at the table, and then something comes up, it's on display, it's on a screen, and somebody says, well, just pick up a pair of glasses. It doesn't matter which glasses you use. Our goal here is that everybody has a pair of glasses. And if I was wearing Sue's glasses, or if I was wearing someone else's glasses, there is no guarantee that I would actually be able to see. So if you think about the universal goal, everyone can see the screen. The universal goal is not everyone has a pair of glasses. Glasses need to be individualized, specific to my vision, left eye, right eye. And it doesn't matter that you can give me a pair of glasses. If they do not suit my circumstances, they are not going to be effective in me being able to see something that you've put in front of me. So if we go to the next slide. And, not knowing what all you were going to put on your poll response, for me, this is like the range of things that happen around population health, looking at the health of a community. It's probably an incredibly incomplete list, but I could take any one of these issues and try to think like, what would be my universal goal around violence? We've got jurisdictions who are saying violence is a public health crisis. We have air and water quality issues. But the thing that we have to try and figure out is, what is it that we're after? What's our goal in any of these areas? And then we come back, and once we understand the goal, we've agreed upon that goal as a community, as a region, what are the multiple strategies that we can put in place so that everyone can reach those goals? And so I think that the next thing that you were going to do was like some breakout discussion just to reflect on this. So Sue, I don't know if I'm turning it back to you at this point.
So you're going to turn it to Christina.
I'm going to turn it to Christina.
I just want to say though, there's a comment in here, the presentation is awesome. I am so grateful. This is amazing, right? In a short amount of time, I'm just like explaining this and just, my mind is going crazy. But anyway, so thank you. Before I turn it to Christina. So
yes, and actually we want to see real quick if there's any questions that the audience has at large that we kind of want to chat with Liz about, and we'll see if we have time for breakouts, but real quick we'll just see if there's any questions that anyone wants to pose right now for the larger group or for Liz. And feel free to speak up or put that in the chat if that's more comfortable for you.
I wanted to address, there was also a comment too that resonated with me during Liz's presentation, just talking about, also the behavioral reasons beyond access. And so in some communities, like addressing that as well. So I wanted to acknowledge that comment.
Thank you so much.
I also wanted to reflect on something Liz was saying. Especially just the glasses example. Not only do we try and give everyone glasses, but also usually when you get your prescription, it's a collaborative process with the eye doctor of asking, can you see what needs do you have? And so I think we can sometimes get into trouble of thinking we understand what the barriers are, but really it needs to be a collaborative process with the people who are trying to serve and understand what their needs are, not making assumptions.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing, Amanda.
I have a question. Liz, you mentioned that you draw on evidence of multiple types to inform your approaches to targeted universalism. I love hearing that, being a data nerd myself. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, because I can imagine that that is really critical to ensuring that you are being inclusive about who you're targeting, how you're targeting them. And like the first thing that comes to mind is like, how do you know that you are addressing all, or at least as many of the needs that are out there as you can? Like, how do you get to that level of saturation and confidence in where you're going with your targeting?
Yeah, Stephanie, it's a great question, and I'm probably going to share with you the other thing that we got introduced to in September of 2017, and it was the concept of failing forward. So I'm probably going to say that I'm not sure that we ever feel like we've gotten adequate information. What we do is every time that we connect with a community organization or a different community than we knew existed, we're asking them, who else should we be reaching out to? I mean, that has just become such a significant strategy for us, so that our circle of influencers continues to evolve over time. I think that that has happened on our board. So, when we started in 2014, our board looks really different than what it looks like today. But what we knew as we started, that we couldn't end up with the same people who designed the system that we have also being the decision makers about the future. So we needed to get, find emerging leaders. We needed to find leaders of color. We needed to actually take ourselves and stop inviting everyone to our meeting. And instead we needed to turn around and go, I wonder where we can go to find out assets and strengths. And instead of us identifying need, because I think, with a lot of this work, now I feel like I'm going to like go off the deep end, but there's so many times when we get data about like our 5 counties as an example, and there isn't a significant amount of data, so they put it into what they call the small numbers, so that the numbers just, they don't show up. So even though we might know there's a strong Marshallese community in our region, there's a strong, large and growing, population who's coming out of Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, we don't see them in the data. So we can't just depend on the data. I then have to turn to my team and say, I wonder how you find out, where do those folks go? Who are their trusted organizations and community? And I'm going to be going to them, potentially first saying, what data do you have about the people that you serve? But after that, it's, I wonder how we can learn, like, what's of importance. What's the priority need there? And sometimes the strategies are just going to look really different if what we want is something that the community is influencing. It might be really, really different than what our data sets might have told us to do.
Thank you, Liz. That's awesome to hear, and a valuable thing that I think a lot of people can learn from.
Thank you. So we have at least one comment in the chat we're going to get to, but before that, Rick has his hand raised. So Rick, please feel free to pose your question.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Liz. This was really helpful. I had heard about Targeted Universalism, had done a little reading on it, and then I totally lost sight of what it was. So this was great to sort of reground in Targeted Universalism. And I love the example of universal goal, 100% high school graduation, and then targeted strategies. That's an easy one because I think people recognize that there are different learning styles and needs, and that different strategies are required to get to that 100%. So what intrigued me about this session was not only Targeted Universalism, remembering what that was, but in a multi-sector collaborative. And if you could tell me a little bit, or if you could share with us a specific example of how North Sound ACH took a different approach to something you were, doing, and switched up your approach using targeted universalism. If that's happened, that would be useful.
Yeah, and do you want me to do that now? Sue, I'm looking to you because I know I was going to do that.
I think we are incredibly flexible with
Okay.
I think we would like to have a little bit of time for people to but please go for it. And we're going to be responsive to the group.
Yeah, and I may address the comment in the chat as well about the jargony stuff, because most often we talk about targeted universalism as a framework. We don't necessarily talk to partners a whole bunch about targeted universalism, because that social determinants of health, like, it is a lot of words to try and get to like, what is it? How does it impact what we do? But there are two examples that I would probably think of. One is in 2017, when Washington got its Medicaid waiver, there were 8 project areas that they wanted to see the 9 ACHs experiment in. And, they were things like behavioral health integration, addressing the opioid crisis, chronic disease, oral health, reproductive, maternal child health, care coordination. Blah, blah. So there were eight of those. And what started happening is folks got into, like how you hear something and then it gets repeated and it kind of becomes like its own reality. And so the reality that became part of our decision making, everybody had to do the opioid stuff and behavioral health integration, and they had to pick 2 additional projects, but nobody had to pick 8. And it became, well, we're all going to do all the projects except for oral health and reproductive maternal child health. The metrics are too hard, and we're just not going to earn enough money out of it. So I watched across the state my colleagues make decisions based on what revenue would come to the region if we made a commitment to those projects. And I mean, I have a board. They're asking me the same questions, like, what's it going to earn us if we do this? But at the end of the day, we ended up making a decision based on a totally different set of criteria. The other one that we committed to was around reducing the number of people who were incarcerated. But there were just like some odd metrics, because metrics are, again, they're based on data that somebody thinks they've got availability to. And so our region out of that map became the only region that committed to work on all 8 project areas. And the reason that we did that, we had introduced folks to this notion of everyone in, leave nobody out. We asked whether we actually had partners who wanted to work in those areas. But we used the targeted universalism, the visual of everybody's got a path to succeed. And when it came time for our decision, which in the waiver, the partners needed to make the decision. They needed to try and influence me, and I told the state our decision. It was, we cannot separate oral health from the opioid crisis. We cannot separate what the challenges are in reproductive and maternal child health without dealing with behavioral health and the opioid crisis. And what they found was that everything was connected to something else. And that if we made a decision to only invest in one, we were doing it at the expense of the others. And so when our region chose, we're like going all in on all 8 of these, what we ended up with was a group of partners who were relieved because their organizations were also focused on multiple things. And so that was probably like the first one. The second one just has to do with money. And from 2014 to 2017, the ACH didn't have any money. And then come 2017 and somebody says, holy crap, the North Sound ACH has the ability to bring $100 million to the North Sound region. Now everybody wants to be a part of the ACH. And so I had health systems, large providers, kind of making the case for the reason that 80% of that $100 million should go to primary care is because all of the impact on health happens at primary care. I think I must have had a dozen meetings with leaders who made the case for me that 80% of what we brought to the region should go to primary care. And in talking with our partners, we had kind of two factors. One was we talked about how ineffective we would be at reducing hemoglobin A1C levels. And for those who don't know, that's like one of the measures for diabetes. If we didn't deal with the cost of medication, people's access to actually having power in their homes, their ability to get to and from the pharmacy, their ability to actually go to the doctor's office. So we were looking at housing, transportation, affordable food, the cost of medications. And we said, you don't manage diabetes in a doctor's office. You manage diabetes in the community. And so that was one factor. And the second goes back to that map of the body of water. And our second one was, in order for us to be equitable, we have to make this work for San Juan County. I wish we could put the map back up. San Juan County, I think, has 17,000 people, but literally our smaller counties around the country are used to being given funds on a per capita basis. So what happens typically, like our largest county, which is Snohomish County, would get like $100 to do something, and San Juan County would get like $2.40. And so we said, instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create the base based on what would make this work in San Juan County. And it meant that anybody who thought they were going to get $100, they might have gotten like 68. But in San Juan County, they actually had enough money to implement a strategy, to hire a person to take on this work. And it carries to this day. We constantly say, if we can make it work in San Juan County, we can make it work anywhere in our region. The inverse is not true. I cannot take something from Seattle or Everett and make it work on Whidbey Island or, on Friday Harbor. It just will not work in the inverse. And so targeted universalism became the way for us to assure, even in our financial decisions, we were looking at how do we make this work for everybody in our region, not just the large providers.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful. So Sue, I think what we're going to do now, and Liz, thank you so much for those examples. Oh, I think we have one more question, and real quick framing for everybody. We'll take this last question, and then Liz, we'll turn it back over to you for the rest of the slides, and then we'll continue on until the deeper dive breakout group. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Jackie, right. Did you have a question, Jackie?
Yes, and I'm okay for the sake of time if we move too. So I'll leave it up to y'all. But my question, just wanted perhaps maybe a comment, but just going off by Liz, what you were saying. One, I agree, like how incredibly powerful this presentation is, and just one aligning one with the efforts we do across the county. And I think that for all transparency, let me see if I can turn the camera off real quick. For all transparency purposes, when you talked about creating that sense of belonging, I think you can see a progression right as I begin and how I enter rooms is because when I entered the room, and you go back to that front slide where there was a picture of a young girl, brave soul, one of a few, it was a question that I had been asking as one, a younger person, right? We in culture, like I would be considered an auntie, right? So we have elders and then we have aunties. So I'm an auntie, although I'm also someone's grandmother, that be David. But in that space is having that sense of belonging. It also allows opportunity for folks to then share. So when you talk about this space and creating, targeted universalism, I have found that it is been very favorable. And when we talk about creating new culture, creating systems and policies that have the least, right, harm when it comes to creating, because we're doing something new, we're all being challenged and tasked to like, if y'all ain't hanging on the skinny branch and the work that you're doing, then please tell me your exact location, because I want to climb that tree. But I feel like in a lot of sense, that's what we're doing. I mean, we're trusting that, you know, if you've done those trust exercises, your communities, you fall backwards and they catch you. This is really what, Liz, the space you have provided for me to come in to expand, because I am very mindful of, one, the voices I bring in a room, because a lot of the work that we do, it exploits, right, our community members, rather than inviting them in to create that plan, that belonging that Liz, that diagram that Liz shows. And so I think that is just one, I just wanted to note that. And I think it's important as, you know, leaders, when we make these decisions, not to do that. Because in my experience right now, for example, Snohomish County being the largest county, you talk about dollars and funds coming through, it's millions and billions. And the consultants they're from Wisconsin, they're from Canada, they're from all these places that have zero understanding of the communities they're working with. And then you're asked community to come in and put themselves and share themselves to build a better, but we have to be mindful of those things. And so I'm just so inspired to be a part of this conversation, and thank you all for inviting us. And for record, Jackie Joanne with Communities of Color Coalition. Thank you all.
Thanks, Jackie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jackie. So yes, we're going to turn it over back to you, Liz, if you want to provide any more context on those examples. I know you already did a lot. So if you just let us know what you're comfortable with.
Okay. Well, you know, I would actually love to, you know, and I know that you still want to do like some breakouts. Can I assume you're still going to do that?
Yes, we still have plenty of time for that.
Okay. So you can go to the next slide, because I think that one was really just about like different examples of, you know, who we contract with. I mean, you know, I think just to add on to Jackie's comments, you know, we are dealing with some structural and systemic issues of who's worthy of taking on a contract, who's worthy of taking on a large contract. And it's almost as if we are paternalistic with our smaller community organizations who have such trust and such strength in community, but we assume they don't have the ability to build capacity to take on some of those larger bodies of work. And therefore we bring in outside consultants to come in. And what do those consultants do? They immediately call me, call Jackie, call the smaller counties, and what I have come to call data mine that information so that consulting group can feel like they have gotten to community voice. And we're not willing to actually think about how do we invest in community so that they can carry their own voice and their own sets of data into a room. So, you know, there's just some of those pieces that I think are also really important. But I want to, if possible, also just think about, as you go into the breakout rooms, to Lynn's comment in the chat, like, how do we make this not about just replacing one set of jargon with another set of jargon? Because I've even seen like the social determinants of health now adding an E. It's the social determinants of health and equity, and it isn't so much about getting people to understand targeted universalism as it is to practice it. How do we get to a point where we are actually trying to find ways to bring people in and to have them help identify some of the strategies that will help them reach the goal that we've set? And, you know, and so, you know, I would love to have Lynn's question kind of be part of what happens in the breakout rooms, because I'd love to hear if you all have some ways that you move beyond the terminology and the naming of things to actually kind of getting to the heart of the work. And, you know, because my goal is certainly not to try and just place another named framework on top of this. It is actually to try and get us to change the way we practice. And, just really appreciated, Lynn, you putting that in the chat.
Thank you so much for that framing, Liz. I think that's fabulous for the entire group as we're thinking about this transition into a session where we're going to do some sense making with one another. So what our plan right now is that we are going to open some breakout rooms, and you are going to be able to self-select into which breakout room you would like to go to. We have kind of framed this around the original poll question of different areas of interest where you might be working. Our thought process here is that you can connect with colleagues who are working in a similar area and talk about how you might be using this framework or how you could use this framework moving forward in whatever space you're operating in. So you'll see at the bottom of this slide the examples of the breakout rooms that we're going to have open. If you do not fit into one of these categories, please feel free to select just one. And if you don't fit into one of them, feel free to go to the other room. And I just want to encourage you all as you get into these rooms to not be discouraged if there aren't a ton of other people in your room. This may be a great opportunity for some self-reflection and some time that you are able to spend just with yourself thinking about how to do this work differently. So whatever the situation is, you're welcome to stay in that room. If you don't feel comfortable, if you're by yourself, you can jump back into the main room. But as Liz mentioned, we're going to reflect kind of on that question that Jackie posed, as well as what mindsets are needed to operate in this way. And really, how would you define a universal goal around a common issue? So we have kind of those three larger questions. We'll be adding those into the chat in just a moment as you guys get into your breakout room, but really think about Jackie's comment. What mindsets are needed to operate in this new way? And also, how would you define a universal goal around a common issue? So we're going to open those breakout rooms right now. If you are having challenges finding that breakout room in the task panel at the bottom, please just feel free in the chat to let us know which room you would like to go to, and we can assign you directly into that breakout room. And I would also encourage you guys, as you get into these rooms, to introduce yourself to one another. Please feel free to share with each other who you are, where you're from, all that good information, and you're welcome to jump in now. If there's
I see we're
anyone,
slowly joining, but for those who may need tech support, at the bottom of your screen to the right, well, mine's located on the right, it looks like a 4 little box window. It says breakout rooms. You can select that. It gives you the option to join the room.
and yes, thank you for those who are chatting me. I'm happy to help assign you directly into a room if you're experiencing challenges. I see a few people left here in our unassigned. So I don't know if Jackie or Josh or Stacy, if you guys want me to put you into a specific room, I'm happy to do that. Okay. And Catherine, feel free to jump into a room if you want to. I am going to add questions into the chat here real quick. Dantes, are you experiencing any challenges? Do you need some assistance to get somewhere? I see one of your, I think you're in the behavioral health room, at least one part of you. I'm not sure if you have a different voice setup versus camera setup, so. Okay. And you're always welcome to share in the chat as well.
Mhm.
Well, I will start. I was hoping that Lynn might jump on. It was really just amazing to be in a room with her, trying to think about how you create space for folks who might seem like the other, to have them feel like this is about us, and create strategies where, you know, folks might see, oh yeah, that's actually how I'd like my neighborhood to be as well. That's actually, how I'd like, my organization to have a positive influence on the same thing. How that might open some doors. But
I was also reflecting on something Lynn said. It was right at the end when we got cut off, but she says we're broadening what we mean by health and well-being. That we have access to more resources, and I just think that's really, the people who are interested in this space, where our resources are and the things that we can help use to improve people's quality of life. That circle is getting bigger as we understand more what contributes to our health and well-being.
Absolutely. Those are hugely important comments. Thank you guys for those. Does anyone, I know that was I think the other room. Does anyone from health system transformation or population health equity room or the aging group want to share?
I'm Bruce with C3. I was in a room by myself with early childhood and adolescent health, and one of the thoughts that just came to mind was how much we think that children are resilient when it comes to being sick, and we kind of overlook those things and think that they'll bounce back, or we ignore certain mental markers that can show lack of development in some cases. And we just chalk it up to, oh, they're young, they'll get over it, they'll learn better. So just trying to be more inclusive when thinking about that. Yeah, so that's what I had to reflect on myself.
Thank you so much for sharing, Bruce. And I just want to applaud you for taking time to be in a room and space on your own. I know that's not always easy, but it's such a treasure to have some blocked off time. So thank you for taking time to do that and sharing your own reflections with us.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Dantes.
Hi, everyone. Dantes. I'm also from C3. And so I started out in the behavioral health room, and I was there by myself, but I did reflect for a little bit. So I actually spent the last 2.5 years, I was a registered behavioral technician. And one thing I realized throughout those 2.5 years, that there was a lack of services I felt really being allocated to the communities that needed it most. And I guess I was reflecting on, just kind of thinking of how would be some ways that we could kind of change that, or maybe go about it in a different way than going through the actual ABA guidelines of things, because I feel like that the way they have things set up there is a major barrier for getting those services to, you know, the communities that really need it most. So that was kind of how I spent that time.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dantes. And certainly, I think a lot of people probably resonate with the systems and structures in place inhibiting the innovation and the ability to do some of these things. So certainly applaud your thought process around how can we circumvent those things? How can we innovate? How can we really bring other opportunities to the surface to address these issues while also working with the systems to try to change the systems? All right, Sue, I think if there's no other major input, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out.
Great. So thank you, Liz. I am so very, very grateful. I am truly inspired. I mean, it validates just the importance of talking to community, right? And just really understanding where they're coming from. And it also just speaks to me the systemic nature, right, of, you know, and I love, like, here's this universal goal, like, what are all of the ways that we can address this? So thank you. We will make the recording available. We will make the slides available. And Liz, you spoke about the primer. So I think when we send this out, we'll include that as well.
Great.
And what I'd love for you to do,
Oh, Sue, you got muted.
I know. You can only do so many buttons at once. So I'd like for you to take a minute to just either answer I learned, I felt, or I am inspired. So just reflect on today. Don't hit enter yet. Just think about that. And I will tell you when you can hit enter. So we will do a thunder chat. So just take a minute to think about I learned, I felt, I am inspired.
And you can select one of the three, right, Sue?
Yeah, yes, just one of the three, unless you feel so compelled to do all. You can do that. Okay. Ready? Okay, go, hit enter. Yay. There's some amazing, ooh, so awesome. Inspired to try harder to bridge, right? And lots of thoughtful reflections. And Liz, would you like to speak yours? Love to hear.
Yeah, and and I also put it in the chat. I was especially am reflecting on both Bruce and Dantes and their comments from sitting by themselves, but those were both perspectives that for me were just really helpful to hear. I'm going to be thinking about those for more than a few hours here, but just the notion that there's a desire and an intentionality to try and be in these kinds of discussions, because they're not always easy. And especially when we toss race and racism and what we need to address looking forward into the mix, I just appreciate all of you just being willing to lean into this conversation, and we keep doing better, and you'll fail forward with us, but maybe you'll fail further ahead than we will. But just being in a space where we can try and sometimes succeed and sometimes just know we need to try something different is pretty incredible. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. So very much appreciate your time. And as Liz said, leaning in. So thanks.
Yes, and don't forget to check out Eventbrite for future webinars. We have a few discussions coming up. I know there's one on October 5th, particular for multi-sector collaboratives and using the tool Lumio and how you can use that for decision making. So we're always coming up with great ways to share content with you guys that may be relevant to your work. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.